What happens to the family of one of history's most infamous war criminals after justice is served? When Adolf Eichmann was captured, tried, and executed, the world believed his story had ended, but it didn't. His wife and sons carried his shadow, choosing silence, denial, loyalty, or rejection. From secret lives in Argentina to defences of Nazi ideology and a rare break from the past, Eichmann's family became a living reminder that evil doesn't always die with the man. Stay with us, because what happened next is more unsettling than many realise. The dinner that destroyed everything. March 1958. Somewhere in Buenos Aires, a blind man named Lothar Hermann sits at his dinner table, unable to see the young man across from him, but listening intently to every word that spills from his mouth. His daughter Sylvia has brought home her boyfriend, a confident German boy named Klaus, who seems eager to make an impression on her family. The conversation flows naturally at first, the usual pleasantries and small talk that accompany such occasions. But then Klaus begins to steer the discussion toward his own family, toward his father specifically, and what starts as casual dinner conversation transforms into something far more dangerous. Klaus Eichmann, the eldest son of the most wanted Nazi still breathing, decides this is the perfect moment to boast about his father's accomplishments during the war, to impress this girl and her family with tales of importance and authority. He speaks openly about how Ricardo Clement, the name his father uses in Argentina, isn't really Ricardo Clement at all, but rather a high-ranking official from the Nazi government who held an important position during the Reich. The young man's arrogance flows freely as he describes his father's work with a pride that suggests he sees nothing shameful in the revelation, nothing dangerous in connecting these dots for strangers. What Klaus doesn't know, what he cannot possibly comprehend in his youthful stupidity, is that Lothar Hermann is not just any German immigrant listening politely to dinner table conversation. The Nazis had beaten him so severely before the war that they left him permanently blind, a brutal reminder of the regime's cruelty that he carries with him every single day of his life. Now he sits in his Buenos Aires home, sightless but not helpless, as his daughter's boyfriend casually confesses to harbouring one of history's greatest monsters. Lothar says nothing during the dinner, asking no probing questions that might alert the boy to his suspicions, but his mind is already working through the implications of what he's hearing. After Klaus leaves that evening, walking out into the warm Argentine night with no idea of the catastrophe he's just set in motion, Lothar begins making careful inquiries through channels that eventually lead him to Israeli intelligence. He shares what he's learned, provides the details Klaus so carelessly revealed, and sets in motion a chain of events that will culminate in one of the most dramatic captures in modern history. The son's need to impress a teenage girl, his inability to keep his mouth shut about his father's past, his fundamental arrogance in believing that their protected life in South America would continue forever. All of these factors converge in that single dinner to doom Adolf Eichmann. One meal, one boast, one catastrophic mistake born from a young man's pride would unravel a decade of careful hiding and bring the architect of the Holocaust to face the justice he thought he'd escaped forever. But would a tip from a blind man be enough to capture one of history's most wanted war criminals? Or would Israeli intelligence need something more concrete before they could strike? The flowers that confirmed a monster. Mossad intelligence officers had received the tip from Lothar Hermann and taken it seriously enough to begin surveillance operations in Buenos Aires, but they understood the stakes involved in what they were planning and knew they needed absolute certainty before acting. Grabbing the wrong man would create an international incident that could damage Israel's standing in the world, undermine their moral authority, and make them look like kidnappers rather than pursuers of justice. For months, agents carefully observed the man who called himself Ricardo Clement, studying his routines and habits, watching him travel to and from his job at Mercedes-Benz. noting the way he interacted with his family and neighbours in the German immigrant community. They documented everything, but still lacked the definitive proof that would allow them to move forward with confidence, the irrefutable confirmation that this middle-aged man living a quiet suburban existence was indeed the bureaucrat who had managed the logistics of genocide with such terrifying efficiency. The breakthrough came on March 21st, 1960, an evening that seemed unremarkable until agents observing the Clement household noticed something unusual about the man's behaviour as he returned home from work. He was carrying a bouquet of flowers, a gesture that might seem mundane and even touching in isolation, the kind of thing any husband might do to mark a special occasion or simply to show affection for his wife. He walked to the door of his modest home and handed the flowers to Vera, who received them with obvious pleasure, and the agents watching this domestic scene unfold understood immediately what they were witnessing. The date mattered more than the gesture itself, because Adolf Eichmann and Vera Liebel had married on March 21, 1935, exactly 25 years before this moment. Ricardo Clement had just revealed himself through an act of tenderness, through the very human impulse to mark his wedding anniversary with flowers for his wife. The man who had tried so hard to disappear into a new identity had betrayed himself by remembering his real past, by maintaining the emotional connections and traditions that defined his actual life rather than his fabricated one. 7 weeks later, on May 11, 1960, Mossad agents made their move with the confidence that comes from certainty. Grabbing Eichmann on a darkened street as he walked home from a bus stop and bundling him into a waiting car. They held him in a safe house for 10 days while arrangements were made, then smuggled him onto an El Al flight to Israel disguised as a crew member recovering from an accident, sedated and hidden in plain sight as the plane carried him toward the trial that would captivate the world. The confirmation didn't end with the flowers though, because Vera herself would provide additional proof in the most ironic way possible when she filed a complaint with Argentine courts about her husband's kidnapping. The legal document she submitted to try to get her husband back stated plainly and officially that Ricardo Clement was Adolf Eichmann. A confession that confirmed to the world what Mossad had already known, that the man they'd captured was indeed the monster they'd been seeking. With their father now facing justice in Jerusalem, surely his sons would want to distance themselves from his crimes and fade into obscurity. Or would they choose a path that would shock even those who thought they'd seen the worst of the Eichmann legacy? The school bus plot. You might reasonably assume that after Adolf Eichmann's very public trial, conviction and execution, his sons would retreat into obscurity, change their names, and try desperately to distance themselves from the most infamous surname in modern history. You would expect them to feel shame, to understand that their father's crimes had marked them forever, to spend the rest of their lives trying to disappear into ordinary existence where no one would know who they were or what their family had done. You would be completely and utterly wrong in these assumptions. Within just months of watching their father hanged in Jerusalem, 3 of the 4 Eichmann sons doubled down on Nazi ideology with a fervour that shocked even the Argentine authorities, who had largely turned a blind eye to the German immigrant community's political leanings. Klaus and Horst, the 2 eldest brothers who had spent the most time with their father before his capture, formed what can only be described as a neo-Nazi terror cell right there in Buenos Aires, recruiting other young men who shared their beliefs and systematically stockpiling weapons in preparation for attacks. Police surveillance of the Eichmann home revealed swastika flags hanging openly in the windows, visible to anyone who passed by on the street, a brazen display that suggested the brothers felt no need to hide their allegiances or moderate their views despite everything that had happened. Horst took it even further by wearing a Nazi armband inside the house as if the war had never ended, as if the Reich still existed somewhere beyond the walls of their middle-class Argentine home, as if history hadn't rendered a devastating verdict on everything his father stood for. The brothers manufactured Molotov cocktails in their basement, collected firearms through various channels in Buenos Aires' underground markets, and distributed propaganda throughout the German community in an effort to spread their ideology and recruit others to their cause. They weren't simply honouring their father's memory in some abstract way, or maintaining a private belief system that hurt no one but themselves. They were actively continuing his work and planning to create new victims in his name. Police reports from 1962, compiled as authorities, finally began taking the threat seriously, describe in chilling detail the brothers' plans to bomb a school bus carrying Jewish children on their morning route through Buenos Aires. The sons of the man who had organised the transport of millions to death camps, who had managed train schedules and camp capacities with bureaucratic precision, were now planning to murder children on their way to school, to create a new generation of victims as a tribute to their father's legacy. When Argentine police finally raided their headquarters and arrested the brothers, they discovered an arsenal that confirmed the seriousness of the threat, weapons, explosives, and stacks of Nazi propaganda materials that left no doubt about their intentions or their ideology. But were all four brothers destined to follow this path of hatred and violence? Or could one of them break free from the poisonous legacy that seemed to consume the rest? The son who chose archaeology over ideology. Ricardo Eichmann was only 5 years old when Mossad agents grabbed his father on that Buenos Aires street corner in 1960. Too young to have formed substantial memories of Adolf Eichmann as a free man living under an assumed name. Too young to have absorbed the full weight of his father's ideology during those formative years when his older brothers were learning to revere what their father had done. His memories of Adolf were not of the man who worked at Mercedes-Benz and socialised with the German community, but rather of the defendant sitting in a glass booth in Jerusalem, of the trial that played out on television screens around the world, of the execution that followed and the aftermath that forced his family to navigate a world that now knew exactly who they were. After the execution, Vera took Ricardo back to Germany, removing him from the South American environment where his brothers would continue to radicalise, and she raised him in a household where certain subjects were simply off limits for discussion. She refused to talk about her husband's crimes, refused to engage with questions about what Adolf had done or why he had done it, maintained a wall of silence that left Ricardo knowing intellectually who his father was, but receiving no guidance whatsoever on how to process that knowledge or what it meant for his own identity. He grew up in this strange, liminal space where the past was simultaneously inescapable and unmentionable, where everyone knew his surname, but no one would discuss what it signified, where he had to forge his own path through a moral wilderness without any map or guidance from the woman who had lived closest to the man at the centre of it all. Ricardo chose education as his escape route and his salvation, throwing himself into academic work with an intensity that suggested he was trying to build a life so completely separate from his father's legacy that the two could never be confused or conflated. He studied prehistory and archaeology at the University of Heidelberg, disciplines that took him as far back into human history as it was possible to go, as far away from the 20th century and its horrors as academic inquiry would allow. Ricardo Eichmann proved he was independent of his father by earning a doctorate through serious scholarship and building his own respected academic career in Germany, eventually becoming director of the Orient Department at the German Archaeological Institute in Berlin. In 1995, he publicly broke from his family by telling Israeli newspapers he was glad Adolf Eichmann was tried and punished, and that he had no connection to his father's ideology. He was the only Eichmann son to openly condemn his father, choosing justice and the victims over loyalty to a horrific legacy. While Ricardo found his voice to condemn his father's crimes, what about the woman who stood closest to Adolf Eichmann throughout his life? Would she ever break her decades of silence? The woman who never spoke. Vera Eichmann outlived her husband by 35 years, dying in 1997 at the age of 88, and in all those decades between Adolf's execution and her own death, she maintained a silence about his crimes that was so complete and absolute, it became its own kind of statement. She spent her final years reading the Bible with apparent devotion, turning to Scripture, perhaps seeking answers or comfort, or simply filling the hours of old age. But she never made a single public statement about what her husband had done, or what she thought about his role in the machinery of genocide. Journalists approached her over the years, hoping she might finally break her silence and provide some insight into the man behind the monster, some human detail that would help the world understand how a person becomes capable of organising mass murder with bureaucratic efficiency. She refused every interview request, declined every opportunity to tell her side of the story, maintained her wall of silence with a determination that suggested she had decided long ago that nothing she could say would matter, or that perhaps she simply didn't want to confront the truth of what her life had been. In trying to understand Vera's silence, you have to consider what speaking would have required of her, what admissions it would have demanded, what reckoning it would have forced her to undergo. To acknowledge Adolf's crimes publicly would mean acknowledging her own proximity to evil, her own failure to see or stop or distance herself from a man whose work resulted in millions of deaths. It would mean confronting the fact that she had loved and lived with someone capable of such monstrous acts, that she had raised his children and maintained his household and supported his work, even if she hadn't known the full extent of it at the time. Her silence might have been denial, a psychological defense mechanism that allowed her to continue living without confronting the enormity of what her husband had done. Or it might have been calculation, a recognition that anything she said would be used against her family and provide no benefit to anyone. Vera Eichmann's silence is deeply disturbing because she lived long enough to witness the consequences of her choices. She saw her sons embrace and expand their father's Nazi ideology, forming terror cells and planning violence, yet she never publicly condemned or questioned their beliefs. She never revealed whether she encouraged, resisted, or felt responsible for their radicalization. When she died in 1997, she took with her every private thought about Adolf Eichmann's crimes, their final prison conversations, and what she told her children about their father. Her refusal to speak left history with unanswered questions and reinforced how silence itself can enable the survival of extremist ideology. If Vera's silence couldn't bury the truth, could the physical destruction of Adolf Eichmann's remains finally put an end to his legacy? Ashes in the Mediterranean, hatred in the living room. The Israeli authorities who planned Adolf Eichmann's execution believed they had thought of absolutely everything, that they had closed every possible avenue through which his death might be transformed into something other than justice served. They hanged him at 1 minute past midnight on May 31st, 1962, making him the only person ever executed by the State of Israel, a distinction that underscored the unique nature of his crimes and the special category of evil he represented. They cremated his body within hours of the execution, reducing the physical remains of the Holocaust's architect to ash and bone fragments that could never become relics for his followers to venerate. Then they took those ashes and scattered them in the Mediterranean Sea, beyond Israeli territorial waters, in international waters where no nation could claim jurisdiction and no shrine could ever be established. The symbolism was powerful and the practical considerations were sound, because they understood that Nazi sympathizers around the world would want a place to gather, a physical location where they could pay tribute to the man they still considered a hero rather than a monster. By scattering his ashes at sea, the Israelis denied them any focal point for their devotion, any grave marker that could become a pilgrimage site, any physical remnant of Eichmann that could be preserved or protected or turned into an object of worship. They tried to erase Adolf Eichmann's physical legacy, believing ashes without a grave would end his influence. They were wrong. Ideology does not need bones to survive. In Buenos Aires, Eichmann's sons showed how beliefs outlive justice. Klaus and Horst remained committed Nazis until their deaths, never condemning their father and openly defending his innocence. Dieter chose silence, living quietly near the site of Eichmann's capture without rejecting or defending him. Only Ricardo escaped the inheritance, building a life in Germany detached from Nazi ideology. The family became living monuments, proving hatred can persist across generations, while rejection remains rare. Did you expect Eichmann's legacy to survive so powerfully through his family? Do you believe ideology can outlive justice, or can it truly be broken? Share with us which family member's path disturbed you the most.